is 2008, and little 13-year-old me goes out to see a marvellous sight. There, at Station Pier in Melbourne, is the Queen Elizabeth II, or to anybody that knew and loved the ship, QE2. This vessel is singular among ships from the second part of the 20th century, in that she served for so long, carrying thousands and thousands of people, millions of miles on holidays, transatlantic crossings, and tropical cruises in a career that spanned 3 generations. But it turns out that this success was not guaranteed from the start. QE2 came at a time when things were changing, and the Oceanliner was dying out. It's kind of an underdog story. So to learn more about how this incredible ship was able to achieve so much, I sat down with Dr. Stephen Payne, naval architect, engineer, and lifelong QE2 fan. He took us all the way back to the start when this ship was part of a new era for the transatlantic Oceanliner, one mired in uncertainty.
1969, Cunard introduced the Queen Elizabeth II. Everybody said that she would be the last transatlantic liner. And Cunard's sort of marketing push was that ships had been boring long enough, and they wanted QE2 to be totally new, totally radical. They didn't want to hark on their past, so almost everything on board the ship was totally different to what had gone before, and there was very little heritage or throwback to the previous Cunard ships. Before her, of course, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth. There were 2 match ships, first proposed in 1926, across the Atlantic on a 5-day schedule, 28.5 knots. Not sister ships, they were radically different. And of course, they used to cross the Atlantic, one going westbound, one going east. They used to cross in mid-Atlantic. And this was the last time the 2 queens crossed on September the 25th, 1967. The Mary had already been sold to the city of Long Beach. The Elizabeth would have 1 more year in service before she too would be withdrawn. 1957, halcyon days, more passengers than ever were crossing the Atlantic by sea and air. But something happened, and that big thing was the introduction of the 707, which was able to cross the Atlantic at speed. Instead of 5 days across the Atlantic, you could do it in 8 or 9 hours. And Cunard originally thought that this would be a fad, that it wouldn't be popular, and that their business wouldn't suffer. Queen Mary was aging quite quickly, and so they were already looking in the late 50s at a replacement that would enter service in the early 1960s. And they came up with the idea for a 3rd queen, the Q3, and she would be a conventional transatlantic liner with very little provision for cruising. And then the financial situation of Cunard was becoming more and more perilous. And on the 19th of October 1961, Q3 was abandoned. The reason being that the shareholders started to revolt, because it was seen by them that a ship that would only be able to go on the Atlantic and wouldn't be suitable for cruising. And so a new ship was devised, one that would be much, much more efficient. Cunard went out with this new design, huge specification. In the end, it was John Brown's who got the deal for 25.4 million, with delivery set for May 1968. Cunard was really in a fight for survival, and Cunard couldn't keep up the payments for the QE2, even with the loan they had. And so they had to withdraw the ships that were running at a deficit and basically sell them to raise money to pay for the continuing building of QE2. And so we see Coronia, Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth, Corinthia and Sylvania all left Cunard service in the period after 1966, with only Franconia and Carmania remaining in service.
It's a real changing of the guard moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think people get very nostalgic, very attached to these ships. And people always ask, why didn't they save Olympic? Why didn't they save Mauritania? And at the end of the day, they're built as a commercial venture.
They are very expensive to maintain. A ship really needs a huge amount of money, even if it's alongside acting as a hotel. June 1967, we're 3 months before launching, and you see that the superstructure is now being erected. At the actual time of launch, you see she's angled that she will go up that inlet there.
I mean, you can see how tight that is. Like, that is such a tight... But this is where some of the biggest ships of the 20th century were launched from. So she really is the last of an era. And in fact, was she the last big passenger ship John Brown built?
Yes, she was.
There's a little bit of sadness attached to it. I mean, it's a beautiful accomplishment, but it really is the end of an era in some ways, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So here we see the bridge.
Wow.
Upside down.
And this is really interesting because this is, again, like reminding me a lot of now design practices they're going to be using on ships like
very
QE2.
Early stages of prefabrication.
Yeah, it's really interesting that she's so utterly groundbreaking for Cunard, because nothing like this had ever been built for them. Like you said, everything had been timber paneled and very classic.
She's already severely late. There were construction delays, materials and everything. So Cunard were hoping to get her into service for the summer season of 1968. It's now November. She's leaving the yard, cautiously going down the Clyde to the open sea. So the big problem was that on that acceptance trip, they found terrible vibration within the main steam turbines, and she limped back to Southampton from her proving cruise, arriving in Southampton on the 2nd of January 1969. And Cunard announced that they were refusing to accept the ship. After work had been done, there was new trials, and then a further voyage, and then finally Cunard accept the ship on the 18th of April 1969. So she was a year late from what they had originally hoped to have the ship. And here she is, ready for a maiden voyage. Cunard flag finally flying from the forward jack.
Really space age in comparison to what had come before. By comparison, she's a pretty remarkable looking ship.
Yeah, absolutely. 22nd of April, setting off, pouring rain, lovely Southampton day.
I was about to say.
Off to New York.
Beautiful British summer.
That's it. I wanted people to understand the operating rationale with the ship. So this is the 1970 transatlantic schedule. And let's take the first line as an example. So she leaves Southampton on the 8th of May, arrives in New York on the 13th, spends a whole day in New York, doesn't leave until the following day, arrives in Southampton on the 20th. Then has 2 days in Southampton before her next voyage. So there's an awful lot of time where the ship's sitting around not earning money.
But last time we talked about the kind of logistics that goes into schedules like these. So we were mentioning, or you mentioned, that the original Queen Mary lacked a laundry. So they're landing and having to get rid of all this stuff. Has this changed by this point?
Yeah, QE2 had a full laundry.
Okay.
Yep.
So again, just big change, but she's becoming more and more recognizable as something that you would find at sea today, really, as like standard operating procedure, where the ship is quite independent.
With the big anticipation of QE2 coming into service, that first season she was very successful, and for most of the second season, the 1970 season, she was, but costs were rapidly increasing to the point where she started to make a loss. And at that time, Trafalgar House, which were a big company in the UK, they did a hostile takeover, took control of the company, and then very rapidly assessed what needed to be done to keep QE2 in service. They decided to spend $2 million on a refit, and you think the ship's only 3 years old at this stage, and $2 million is a huge amount of money. But they added 10 balcony suites in that forward sports court, and we see here the upper level, or the promenade deck, and the upper level of the double room, so the double up with the well, and we see the original shops. So they were all stripped out, and extra cabins were built where the shops are there, and the space there adjacent to the well became the new shopping arcade, which remained to the ship's final withdrawal. And then in 1977, the iconic Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary suites were added, these being the most expensive cabins on the ship, really expensive to occupy those cabins.
Possibly more so than any other ship. The QE2 became, in many ways, I think, like real hodgepodge of style and everything, because they were just constantly adding to it and changing.
That's right.
Whereas really the Queen Mary of, the 30s hadn't changed a lot by the time she was withdrawn from service. I mean, there were obviously some changes, but you weren't having, aside from the engineers' accommodation, whole pieces of superstructure added at a time.
Yeah, post-war, there was very little done to the Queen Mary. A lot of the changes occurred immediately after the war, but then from then on, very little was done. The big event in the ship's life, of course, was the Falklands campaign in the 1980s, 1982, when she was called up to become a troop ship to take the British Army down to the Falklands. Government were really, really worried about putting the ship in harm's way, and so she only sailed to St Georgia. She didn't sail to the main Falkland Islands, and she offloaded the troops off St Georgia, and off she goes.
Yeah, truly a historic moment. It's unusual in many ways, because you would think that obviously they needed to get a lot of men somewhere at very short notice, relatively speaking, but of course nowadays, the Navy has, dedicated, vessels like landing craft and things like that. It seems unusual to, even as late as 1982, be kind of doing a repurposing of a civilian liner in the same way that they had in the Boer War. And, it's very interesting that. And
then Trafalgar House, constantly upgrading the ship, decided to fit a magrodome at the aft end. And the idea of this was that it would be used like for afternoon tea and as a sort of beginnings of a Lido restaurant.
It's interesting because QE2 is a ship designed for a different era, really, even though it's only been a little over maybe like 10, 15 years of service. It's like, she was designed in the 60s when the previous generation of liner was the Queen Mary, and the Queen Elizabeth. Yep. And now with this kind of Lido area, this is very much what you'd find on a ship now, but of course they're designed and built with these things already. You've got your enclosed pool, typically like amidships, as on Queen Mary 2 and Aurora, and then you've got exposed pools aft, which works really well. And but it's interesting that they're trying to put all these new kind of like revolutionary in some ways, things that we now accept on cruise ships, on a ship that was in many ways, even though she was groundbreaking for her time, she still has the profile in some ways of an older ship, but she's still in my opinion, a ship from a different era. It's very interesting. I love that kind of mixing and matching and trying to see what works.
QE2 at this time was becoming very, very unreliable, had constant breakdowns, and it was basically because she really did need that fourth boiler with 3 in steam. And Trafalgar House also put the ship on the schedule that we see today, where the ship would come in at 7 in the morning and sail the same day in the afternoon, because they eliminated the days in port where basically the ship wasn't earning any money. And because of that, they couldn't do maintenance on the boilers, and very rapidly the boilers began to fail. They had to decide what they were going to do And with only 10 hours in port, as we've said, for the 5-day transatlantics, you just needed all 3 of those boilers running.
So that time in port over the course of, think about it, 35, so like 40, 50 years has gone from days to a day to 10 hours. That is
10 hours. That's remarkable. It. They concluded that if she couldn't be re-engined with a much more fuel-efficient plant, then they would have to sell the ship, and that she would probably be sold for scrap. But they had to come up with an idea and do drastic surgery on the ship.
She seems to be, these times are so uncertain that the ship is constantly dodging existential threats, where their Trafalgar House is doing their best to keep this thing relevant in this very rapid fire changing world that she now finds herself in. Very, very clever business maneuvering by Cunard and Trafalgar House on this.
And then these are the diesel engines, and you see how big they are from the man standing beside it. Absolutely massive, 9 of them. And then the Grand Lounge. With this view, you see the shopping arcade there that was originally that double up area, and the remaining library was transformed from this configuration to the configuration that we all remember on board.
One of the finest libraries available at the time, jammed with maritime history, right? Wasn't it just absolutely full of the classics? That model looks like Aquitania?
I think it was Aquitania, from what I remember.
So what's funny is, even though she was made to break away from this traditional, in many ways, Cunard heritage, she ends up kind of almost becoming a time capsule.
Yep, there was a refit done where they brought on all the heritage trials and that, because they wanted to compete with the new cruise ships and the new lines that had no heritage. And of course, the one thing Cunard had was the heritage. So the idea was to flood the ship with memorabilia, models, menus, knickknacks, to give that identity, to set them apart from the other cruise ships. And then everything was going well until the 1990s, when sadly Trafalgar ran into problems and was bought by Caverna, and they had no interest in Cunard. They just wanted the construction business, cementation. And so Cunard was identified as non-core and put up for sale, and nobody really wanted it, because at this stage Caverna didn't want to invest in QE2. But out the blue, and I must admit I had no inkling at all this was going to happen, in May 98 Carnival stepped in and bought it. And of course, a lot of the emphasis on this came from the movie Titanic, where so many people started to wanting to do a transatlantic crossing that QE2 sailings became more popular. And suddenly Cunard appeared to be a better bid. And so Carnival stepped in and bought it. And then, of course, Queen Mary II came about and entered service in 2004, took over the transatlantic run, and QE2 thereafter became a dedicated cruise ship. Still immensely popular. Of course, QE2 was nearly 40 years old at that stage, and ships can't go on forever. The big problem is the hull may be sound, and you have to keep that obviously in good condition throughout the life of a ship. So QE2 had constant repairs for cracking and everything. But the big problem is the machinery on board, the air conditioning plant and the sewage system, the lifts. As they begin to wear out, you cannot get spare parts, because companies don't keep inventory for equipment that's 40 years old. And so you either have to make spare parts yourself, or you have to change the machinery for new. And it becomes more and more that point where you're spending more money on maintenance than is warranted by the profits from the ship. Mm-hmm. And so out of the blue, Dubai offered to buy the ship. And so it was announced that the ship would leave service in October, November 2008, and would become a hotel in Dubai. And so that's really it. The ship left service, ended up in Dubai. They were going to completely strip the ship. There was going to be a new funnel built of glass, which was going to be a penthouse. But by the time the ship arrived in Dubai, there had been the financial downturn of 2008, and there was no money to do anything. And so the ship was left. They did have designs on putting the ship back into service, and they started a contract with MAN to recondition the diesel engines. And then midway through that, there was a dispute, and MAN walked off the job, and the engines were left dismantled and very quickly became corroded in the humid air of Dubai, and were basically ruined. And so that fell through. And it wasn't until, I think 2018, wasn't it, Mike? Something like that. She opened as the hotel with very little done. And they've been working through the ship in a piecemeal fashion, gradually rebuilding the ship and configuring it as a hotel out in Dubai.
There's so many different angles to this. You've got the design and construction of an ocean liner at a time when ocean liners were dying out. You've got this extraordinary career, and then this epilogue, which is that she is still around. Stephen, what an absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for running us through it. Until next time, we'll see you again, Stephen, and everybody else, thanks for tuning in, and we'll speak again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.